Attempts to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian dispute at an apparent standstill, continuing concern about Iran's nuclear stance. Is a new international approach needed to address these issues that have defied resolution? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to this special edition of Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna in Beirut, and the occasion, a conference organized by the Carnegie Middle East Center. In focus, the question of what the world's major powers can or should do in confronting issues in the Middle East. Has the US-led Palestinian-Israeli peace initiative run its course? And what specific roles could China and Russia play in creating a more stable region? Well, with me to discuss this issue, our panelists, Jessica Matthews, a member of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations and the president of the Carnegie Endowment, the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, Dmitry Trenin. He's also a former senior research fellow at the NATO Defense College and the Institute of Europe, and Min-Shin Pei, a senior associate in the China program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and also the author of From Reform to Revolution, The Demise of Communism in China and the Soviet Union. Let's begin with Dmitry Trenin. In recent months, Russia has hosted the leaders of both Fatah and Hamas, as well as a state visit by the Israeli Prime Minister. Does this flurry of diplomatic activity signal a greater degree of Russian involvement in resolving this ongoing dispute?
The short answer is yes. The interesting thing is what lies behind it. Unlike the Soviet Union, Russia has no ideology to promote or support. It does not have permanent allies or permanent foes. It prefers to deal with everyone and anyone who has some relevance. If it's a group that holds power in a certain region of the Middle East, that group is eligible to have contacts with Moscow, whether the group is called Hamas or something else. They also have a pretty close relationship with Israel. They welcome Israeli ministers and prime ministers on a regular basis to Moscow. They established pretty serious contacts with Saudi Arabia, with the Gulf states. So it's a very different world of Russian foreign policy in the Middle East. So they want to be players. They don't want to be simply a piece of furniture in the quartet. In order to be more than that, you need to know the region. You need to be in contact with the major players or with all the important players. You need to be present in the region, and that's what Russia is attempting to do.
Is this going to be helpful to the United States? For so long, we've had a virtually unilateral approach. The roadmap has been, in the U.S. view, the only map in town, and yet this appears to have run out of steam. Even the question of proximity talks at the moment are very close to being frozen. Does the U.S. need new energy? Does it need and encourage international partners to address this resolution?
Well, I think it needs new energy, but I'm not sure it's going to come from Russia. Again, I think Dmitry's point earlier that is the removal of a negative, the removal of blocking strategies is the critical one. The U.S., I think, certainly doesn't feel that it's acting unilaterally on this issue. The quartet has been the vehicle for a very, very long time and will continue to be. But President Obama has, over the last year, opened a new chapter, certainly a chapter that is quite different from the last 20 years, over the last 20 years, of a willingness to say to Israel, the policies that you are currently following do not serve your national interest and do not serve ours. And that is different. Whether it will be enough to change the calculus enough to even get the parties to the table, it certainly hasn't yet proven to be. Where I think we, and I will say that I think though the policy he has followed over the last year would have been impossible 5 years ago within the US domestic political context. He has said things, and people in Washington are saying things that were taboo not very long ago. It's important to remember that the US domestic conversation about Israeli-Palestinian issue is much more constrained than the Israeli conversation, for example. There are things that are said every day in Israeli papers that you just couldn't say in Washington. And that's changing. And the president has been, I think, instrumental in making that change. Where I don't know is whether, when it comes to the need to exert real leverage, the real coin of the realm is whether the US is willing to cut off certain funding. Money is going to be, again, the tripwire here, the symbolic act, if not the real one. And I think we're not there yet. But I don't know whether we will get there.
We'll come back to that point, but that issue of leverage, China, for example, close relationships with Israel, close relationships with Iran, close relationships with Syria, close relationships with countries in this region that the US is not talking to. Can China use this leverage? Can it introduce a new aspect to this problem?
Well, the most China can do is to be a cheerleader if something good is happening. China appointed a special envoy to the region in 2002. That's a step forward. But the bad news is that the envoy is a retired diplomat and has very little political clout. So that means China is willing to provide inexpensive moral support if the US is leading in the right direction. China's relationship with Israel used to be very good, but has cooled in recent years because of the deterioration in, because of American opposition to Israeli exports of very sensitive military technology to China. So from China's point of view, this is a region where the US traditionally has remained dominant, and if China barges in uninvited, however good China's intentions are, China will end up losing rather than winning. That's why China is playing the role of a cheerleader.
But to an extent, that has been the position of Russia as well, Dmitry. And yet there does seem to be a new activity. There does seem to be a degree of frustration with the lack of progress in any attempts at reaching resolution. And Russia is once again talking to the players. It is talking to Hamas. It is in relationship with Syria. There is a greater involvement with the major players who in US policy have been largely left out of the process.
Well, I would say that the Russians talk to the people, among other people, to whom others don't talk, like Hamas. So the Russians are exploiting an opportunity which is out there. But someone has to talk to people in power in Gaza. They stay in touch with those people. They stay in touch with the people in the West Bank. It's not that Russia would come up with a magic formula. I would not expect that from Russia. I think Russia also does not have an overriding geopolitical interest of its own in that part of the world. It's beyond the area which the Russians denote, rightly or wrongly, the zone of their privileged interests. This is beyond the zone. It means that Russia is open to team play with the US, with Europe, with China, in various combinations. So the Russians simply, I think this is a function not so much of their interest in the Middle East per se. This is a function of their self-perception of a great power. Now, if you're a great power, you must have some public goods on offer. For a long time, the Russians talked of being great power with having very little to offer to others. Now, this time they may be, well, they are re-emerging as a country with an international responsibility, i.e. Iran, i.e. the Israeli-Palestinian issue, i.e. some other issues. So they are talking and listening and rebuilding their own presence, light and yet real, and they're ready to play. The Russians today are no longer interested in a fight with the US for global domination. But what they're interested in is being one of a half dozen major players at the top table of the world. That's what they want. And that can only be achievable if they can show that they have something to offer, if they can show that they can produce some public goods. I think there's a lot of room for Russia to improve, but that's where Russia is headed.
To stick with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the conventional exercise in dealing with it has been the thought that if you get a resolution there, that will then move to regional stability. Is it not the time perhaps to think of create a degree of regional unity and stability and common purpose, and out of that you get a resolution in a small area? Is that a possibility that there could be a change in thought coming through the greater involvement of the major powers?
I think there's a possibility, but I don't think it comes through the major powers. I think it has to come from the Arab governments acting themselves together in search of a common position that they will exercise with vigor in the recognition that this is their problem too, that this is a problem that festers throughout the region, affects all of them. It has to come from that conviction together and a willingness to act together.
Mentioned to follow up on that, I mean, Saudi Arabia, for example, a very close and very economically viable partner of China. Would there be any contemplation ever to use that as leverage to get some type of common position on the issue?
No, again, China sees the region very, very differently, and the region has very unrealistic expectations of China. Since the end of the Cold War, China is the most powerful country to have emerged on the local scene, and the countries in the region expect China to be a natural strategic balancer against the US. That's the last thing China wants to do. China sees the region as a secure source of energy supply, that's it. And so if you want China to work actively with Saudi Arabia to provide some regional public good, that is the solution of the Arab-Israeli conflict, China will say, thank you, but no thanks. That's not what we are in business for. We are in to bargain for long-term secure oil supplies. If you want to talk to me about regional peace and stability, I can send you a retired diplomat, but that's it.
Dimitri?
Jessica, want to say something?
Let me add to that, since the end of the Cold War, it's no longer the business of the major powers to fix the problems around the world. This is something that all the parties to the conflict should awaken to. And this is true of the Middle East. This is true of Nagorno-Karabakh. This is true of each and every conflict around the world. Other people will simply not be, because there's no zero-sum game anymore. There's no longer this refrain, this land is my land, and that land is your land. We're out of that. And that is, I would simply want to stress the point that Jessica has made before.
It's a bit of a bleak prognosis, Jessica. I mean, the fact that that the major powers don't play that game anymore in terms of attempting to bring stability into regions in which they have interests?
Oh, but I don't agree with that at all. I mean, the net effect of the competition during the Cold War, while it may have made the superpowers more involved, was certainly negative for every region in which there was a standoff and a conflict and a competition for influence. I mean, I don't think that's even close.
Well, I think it really places burden on the U.S. because the U.S. leadership now becomes really indispensable. China and Russia will only get involved if the U.S. has a credible policy, has a workable policy, and then the American ally in the region, particularly Israel, is willing to follow that policy. Otherwise, it's none of China's business, it's none of Russia's business, I would say.
Jessica, I mean, the question directly to you. Credible policy, workable policy, can the Obama administration introduce those? We've heard the possibilities of a wider support should such a policy be introduced.
You know, there are problems for which there are no solutions. And there are times when problems have no solution. We may be in such a time right now. And the tragedy so often in world history and in diplomacy is you have issues where one government is ready to act and the other one isn't, and a few years later that government is ready and the other one isn't. Now we have a government in Washington that is ready to spend political capital, a lot of political capital, on this issue. We went through 7 years in the Bush administration until its very last year where the view was, well, if the other parties are not ready to sit at the table, we don't want to do anything. And I think there is a consensus in Washington that that was a huge mistake, that was a terribly costly approach, and that the passage of time in this region right now on this issue does not conduce to anybody's interest. It's worse for the Palestinians, it's worse for Israel long term, it's worse for everybody who suffers the indirect consequences. But that said, I think, I hate to say this, but I think it's true, I think Israel is more than the present government, or maybe the present government reflects it. I think Israel right now doesn't any longer believe in peace, believe in the possibilities of peace in the near term, in the way that it used to 20 and 30 years ago. I think the Palestinians are not in a position to play a particularly unified role in being a partner in that effort either. So, and Obama is only a piece of our political equation. We have a Congress to think about as well. And so with the greatest desire in the world and even the greatest effort in the world, and he's facing a huge number of other problems. I can't say I'm hopeful, but he has changed the equation dramatically at some substantial political cost to himself, and has is at least looking at an even more costly potentially set of decisions in this decision that has been broached now that the U.S. would put a peace plan on the table, its own peace plan on the table. So, and it again, I think if it has any chance of success, it will need a unified, vigorous support from Arab governments.
Dimitri, do you think that the equation has been changed in the region?
I think that the equation has been changed in Washington, D.C. I fully agree with Jessica. This is a change that that I think needs to be, I hate to use the word exploited, but this is a chance. This is a chance for the region. This is a chance for the Arab governments This is a chance for all the players in this part of the world. If they're interested in solutions, the United States is out there to help them. But it's they who will have to want solutions at least as much as the United States does. And I think that this is an opportunity. Hopefully, I think that the change has happened in Washington. This equation was changed in Washington. I don't see it has changed in the Middle East yet. And time is running out. I'm hopeful, but time is running out for that.
You've stated repeatedly about China's hands-off policy, but is there at any point where national interest, China's national interest, is dependent on a greater degree of security within the region that it is operating in and relying to a large extent on its development on?
Oh, China already has substantial national security interest in the region as well, but to the extent that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict does not affect that overall security, China does not have an interest in that particular conflict. I just want to say how the Chinese view this conflict. They view this conflict both where there's a great deal of sympathy for the Palestinians, but they also view this conflict with total puzzlement. How, it's not exactly that complicated conflict from the Chinese standpoint. If you are pragmatic, you can propose solutions to solve this problem. This, for the Chinese, this is the age. This is the golden age of globalization, of capitalism, of making money. And the Chinese are so happy that they are now at the forefront of this new train. And they look at the Middle East and say, what are these people thinking? They are missing this last train out of the station. And so this is a slightly off the script, but I think this is something that people in the region really should think about. Is the problem so deeply embedded, the hatred such, that we can't do a thing about this?
Well, we've had a degree of convergence there. Dimitri made the point that this is opportunity now. You are making the point that there's opportunity now. Jessica, is there opportunity now? Is there a little chink?
Yes, as I said, I think you have in Washington a U.S. president who is willing to spend a great deal of political capital and to change the U.S. position and to take positions that entail a great deal of tension, discomfort, and discord with one of the U.S.'s closest allies. That is a change and a very positive one, and it's an opportunity, as Dimitri said. Whether it will be enough, I have no idea, but one can't be too hopeful, I think.
Well, that brings us to an end of this special edition of Inside Story. My thanks to Jessica Matthews, Dimitri Trenin, and Minxing Pei. And my thanks to you for watching. If you've got any comments or ideas, please email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Mike Hanna, and the rest of the team here in Beirut, bye for now.